Hello, I'm Shauna Lawhorne with the League of Women Voters. Along with the League and SFGovTV, I'm here to discuss Proposition A, a ballot measure that will be before the voters on Tuesday, November 6th. The 100-year-old Embarcadero Seawall is the foundation of approximately 3 miles of San Francisco's northeastern waterfront. The seawall supports Muni, BART, and power and water utilities. The seawall no longer adequately protects the city from tides, floods, and rising sea levels. The seawall is also not protected from earthquake damage. Through the Port of San Francisco, the city is responsible for maintaining the seawall. The city plans to modernize, upgrade, and repair the seawall over the next 30 years. The port's recommended plan is estimated to cost up to $5 billion, and the city seeks to finance the first phase. To pay for large capital projects, the city relies on several funding sources, including borrowing money by selling general obligation bonds. The city uses property tax revenues to pay the principal and interest on these bonds. Proposition A would authorize the city to borrow up to $425 million by issuing general obligation bonds to modernize, repair, and upgrade the Embarcadero Seawall. The Citizens General Obligation Bond Oversight Committee would review the spending of general obligation bond revenue proceeds. The city will conduct a public process to determine the specific projects to modernize, repair, and upgrade the seawall. The bond will fund ongoing design and construction improvements that address the most significant earthquake and flood risks to the seawall. Proposition A would allow an increase in the property tax to pay for the bonds if needed. It is city policy to limit the amount of money it borrows by issuing new bonds only as prior bonds are paid off. Landlords would be permitted to pass through up to 50% of any resulting property tax increase to tenants. A yes vote means, if you vote yes, you want the city to issue up to $425 million in bonds to modernize, repair, and upgrade the Embarcadero Seawall. A no vote means, if you vote no, you do not want the city to issue these bonds. I'm here with David Aldridge from the Yes on A campaign and a proponent of the measure. Hi.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Starchild, a member of the San Francisco Libertarian Party and an opponent of the measure.
Thank you, Shauna.
Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with some opening remarks, and we'll start with David.
Proposition A is essentially about strengthening our seawall and protecting the city in the face of earthquakes and sea level rise. The seawall is the foundation of our waterfront, going all the way from Fisherman's Wharf to AT&T Park. 24 million people visit it every single year. It protects valuable infrastructure like water lines, gas lines, sewer lines. It also protects regional transit like BART, Muni, and the ferry system. And it is a critical emergency response area. And it protects $100 billion in assets and property, both workplaces and where people live. Because it was built 100 years ago, it can no longer do the job of protecting the city, particularly in the event of an earthquake. A major earthquake could happen at any moment. Scientists are certain that one will probably happen in the Bay Area within the next 25 years or so. And if that fell, then the seawall would fall, which would be catastrophic for the city. We are also concerned about sea level rise. We are already seeing waters crest over the Embarcadero on king tide days, particularly at Pier 14. And if that is tied with a storm surge, that water could reach the Muni Tunnel right there on the Embarcadero and render our regional transit inoperable. So we know we need to fix the seawall. We know it's not going to be cheap, but we have found funding solutions, the statewide and the federal level. And Proposition A would be a down payment, and it's something we must do to make sure we have a resilient and strong waterfront and city.
Thank you, David. Starchild.
So the measure calls this a seawall. It's a bit misleading. It's actually the promenade along the bay that people walk on next to the Embarcadero roadway, and it's roughly the same height as the roadway behind it. Exactly what it's supposedly protecting, in its current form is not clear. They want to make it taller, I understand, but they're not talking about exactly how much taller, probably because people know it's going to potentially ruin views of people traveling, biking along the waterfront. The U.S. Geological Survey found that by the end of the century, Relative to sea levels, this is a quote, relative to sea levels in 2000, by the 2070 to 2099 period, sea level rise projections range from 11 to 54 centimeters, unquote, at the low end to, quote, 17 to 72 centimeters at the highest, unquote. In other words, just over 2 feet of increase at the most, you know, nearly 100 years from now. When you look at all the other priorities that San Francisco has, homelessness, the need for housing, schools, parks, healthcare, all kinds of things we could be spending this money on. Do we really want to spend $5 billion? This is going to be cutting the budgets of residents, both property owners and tenants who would face higher rents as a result of this measure. And the amount that they're charging up front is not even the full cost of it. Willie Brown said, news that the Transbay Terminal is something like $300 million over budget should not come as a shock to anyone. We always knew the initial estimate was way under the real cost, and that's true for this so-called seawall, I think, as well.
Okay, thanks, Starchild. The first question is just very basic. Why exactly do you oppose this proposition?
Well, for starters, a lot of the land that we're talking about along the waterfront is leased by various commercial businesses. If they want to upgrade their sections of the seawall, they should be able to do that on their own without turning to the taxpayers for a bailout. This is really subsidizing a lot of well-to-do commercial enterprises and potentially people who live along the waterfront. The ballot measure language makes it sound like it's protecting the entire city, but that's obviously nonsense. You know, people up in higher elevation parts of San Francisco are not going to be threatened by any water coming over the wall. If water did somehow get into the Muni Tunnel or something in an extreme rare event, it would be much cheaper to pump that water out. And I've seen, you know, water coming up over the promenade a little bit when people, and it's no big deal, really. You know, this is a huge project, you know, a solution in search of a problem, really.
Great. Why do you support the measure, David?
Well, I want to take issue with a few things Starchild said there. First of all, he mentioned that we should just make it taller. That's not what this is about. This is about strengthening the seawall. There are different ways of doing that. Heightening it is definitely one option, but you can also look at various solutions that New York is taking, for instance, where they're actually reseeding oyster bays, and perhaps you would want to do something like actually create almost this like kind of like marsh-like bump, because marshes are sort of nature's perfect seawall. So there's a lot of different aspects that you want to take a look at and make sure you're doing the right thing, and we shouldn't just say it has to be taller. Second of all, cost of $5 billion would not go to San Francisco directly. As I mentioned, there are federal programs which we would be tapping into. We were lucky enough to get a new start from FEMA. On the statewide level, we will see funding as well. And then lastly, he mentioned the big players. We're talking about the Giants Ballpark, the Exploratorium. They are actually contributing as well to something called the Community Facilities District, as well as the fact that the newer construction happening down by India Basin is also contributing on their own dime to prepare for sea level rise as well. The last thing, if I could just get this in, it is a general obligation bond, so it does not raise property tax rates. I just want to make sure that's clear.
Great. Which leads into my next question, which is why is a bond measure the right or wrong way to upgrade the seawall?
Absolutely. Well, I think first of all, because it wouldn't raise rents and it wouldn't raise property taxes. Second of all, because of the fact that it is $425 million, it's outside of the discretionary ability of the Board of Supervisors, which is why they unanimously voted to make sure that it was on the ballot this November.
Borrowing, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, ultimately billions for this entire project, which they're not putting on the table now. When you borrow money, you're going to have to pay it back. So saying it's not going to raise property taxes, you know, respectfully, I think is incorrect. Ultimately, it will mean residents paying more money. And I think the Port Commission, Port Authority, should look to cutting their own costs. The Port Director, as of 3 years ago, was paid over $340,000 a year in salary and benefits. I think they need to tighten their own belts before turning to the public. And I didn't say, by the way, that the wall should be higher, David. I think they're going to make it higher. I think that's part of the plan, although they're not talking about that because I think that might turn some people off to the project. It's done for over 100 years a good job of doing what it does, and it hasn't posed major problems, and they didn't spend billions of dollars to construct it back then with the technology they had. I think it can do an adequate job going forward without taking this money away from priorities that are more important and more urgent for the city.
Great. Closing statements, we'll start with you, David.
I don't think there is any priority more important to the city than protecting San Francisco for future generations. This is definitely something that would affect the entire city. As I mentioned, our regional transit is dependent upon the seawall being stable. In addition, in the event of a major emergency, we are scheduled to receive life-saving supplies along the waterfront. If we don't have a waterfront, we will see critical delays, and that will affect communities at risk all across the city. I think it's kind of a no-brainer. We have the ability to actually make an investment in our infrastructure and take the preventative steps, which would be 6 to 10 times cheaper than if we actually had to do this all in retroactive. So we have the ability to invest in our infrastructure without raising property tax rates. I don't see why we wouldn't do it.
Thank you, David. Starchild?
It doesn't protect the entire city. The water is seriously not going to go up to Twin Peaks. You know, the earthquake effects the seawall might somehow allegedly mitigate are not going to change anything for people living in the entire western half of the city or even anywhere close to that. It doesn't even protect all of downtown. You know, I think they're saying this to try to justify basically subsidies for people in the immediate area who might be at some risk of water damage or maybe the promenade cracking. It's not going to prevent anybody from evacuating the area. It's not going to prevent emergency services from having access. I mean, we have a huge thoroughfare there, you know, which is going to be accessible. It's not going to be entirely flooded. These are really, I think, alarmist kind of projections. It just doesn't support spending billions of dollars. You know, we have more pressing needs in the community. This is something the port wants, and if they want it so badly, they should hit up their leaseholders and tighten their own salaries. You know, 6-figure salaries for people at the Port Commission is you know, I don't think it's warranted. You know, all these salaries are paid by people, including homeless people, unemployed people. The poor people are paying for these 6-figure salaries of people working in government, and they're going to raise our costs ultimately. The businesses have to pay more money, property owners have to pay more money. The costs get passed along to members of the public and higher prices. This will hurt ordinary people in San Francisco.
Thank you both for your comments and your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope that this discussion has been informative. For more information on this and other ballot measures in this year's election, please visit the San Francisco Elections website at sfelections.org. Remember, early voting is available starting October 9th at City Hall, Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. You can also vote at City Hall on the 2 weekends before Election Day from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And if you don't vote early, be sure to vote on Tuesday, November 6th.